On the morning of June 3, 1864, thousands of Union soldiers stepped forward at Cold Harbor and walked straight into disaster. In less than an hour, around 7,000 of them were killed, wounded, or missing. The attack collapsed almost as soon as it began. The men who survived were not frightened recruits seeing battle for the first time. Many were veterans who had already lived through places like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. Some of them, expecting the worst before the assault even started, quietly stitched their names onto their uniforms so their bodies could be identified later. That image tells you almost everything about the kind of war the American Civil War had become by 1864. The early romantic ideas of honor and glory were gone. What remained was a hard, industrial kind of warfare built on trenches, artillery, railroads, factories, and endless casualty lists. At the center of that change stood Ulysses S. Grant. What made Grant different was not that he loved bloodshed or failed to understand its cost. It was that he had come to believe something cold and terrible. The only way to save the Union was to keep going, no matter how awful the losses looked in the moment. To many people, that made him seem like a butcher. To Grant, it made him a commander facing reality. To understand why he refused to stop, you have to understand the pattern he broke. For 3 years in the Eastern Theater, Union generals had followed almost the same script. They would gather the Army of the Potomac, march south into Virginia, fight Lee, take losses, and then fall back north to regroup. George McClellan did it. Ambrose Burnside did it. Joseph Hooker did it. Even George Meade, after winning Gettysburg, did not destroy Lee's army. By 1864, this cycle had become almost expected. Lee had learned to count on it. So when Grant arrived in Virginia and launched the Overland Campaign in May 1864, Lee likely assumed he was facing just another Union commander who would eventually do what all the others had done. And at first, the campaign seemed to fit the old pattern. In the wilderness, Union troops fought in a nightmare landscape of dense woods, smoke, confusion, and fire. Men were shot at close range without even seeing who was firing at them. Some wounded soldiers were burned alive as brush fires swept through the forest. Grant's army lost roughly 18,000 men there. Most of the Army of the Potomac expected that after such a battle, they would retreat. That was how this war worked. But on May 7th, instead of turning back north across the Rapidan River, Grant ordered the army south. That single move changed the psychology of the campaign. The soldiers understood it immediately. A cheer reportedly went up when they realized they were marching deeper into Virginia instead of retreating. For the first time, many of them felt they were following a commander who would not back away from Lee after a bloody fight. But if that gave the rank and file a new sense of purpose, it also meant the bloodshed would continue. The next major clash came at Spotsylvania Courthouse. There, Lee had dug in behind strong fortifications, including a protruding section of line known as the Mule Shoe Salient. Grant attacked anyway. On May 12th, Union forces under Winfield Scott Hancock smashed into the position and briefly broke through, but Confederate reinforcements poured in and the fighting turned savage. At the bloody angle, men fought for hours in mud, rain, smoke, and close quarters, so brutal that later descriptions seemed almost unreal. By the end of that day, around 17,000 men from both sides had become casualties. And still, Grant did not stop.
That was the part many around him struggled to accept. His army had already endured the wilderness in Spotsylvania. The men were exhausted, shaken, and angry. Officers were worn down too. Grant had come east as general-in-chief, but George Meade still technically commanded the Army of the Potomac, and tension between their circles was real. Many officers doubted the relentless pace. Some questioned Grant privately. Others came close to open resistance in spirit, even if they obeyed in practice. Then came North Anna, then Bethesda Church, then Cold Harbor. By the time the army reached Cold Harbor in early June, it had been fighting almost continuously for a month. The men had seen too much, marched too far, and buried too many friends. Lee's army had fortified the ground well. His troops were behind earthworks, rifle pits, and artillery positions on strong terrain. The Union soldiers knew what that meant. Many sensed the coming assault would be a slaughter before it happened. They were right. At dawn on June 3rd, Grant sent forward a massive attack. The Confederates, protected behind their defenses, tore into the advancing Union ranks. In less than an hour, the assault was broken. The Union had gained almost nothing. The losses were staggering. Later, Grant himself admitted that the attack had been a mistake. In his memoirs, he wrote that he had always regretted ordering that final assault at Cold Harbor because no advantage was gained that justified the price.
That admission matters. It shows Grant was not blind to failure, and he was not numb to suffering. He knew Cold Harbor had gone horribly wrong. But even regretting that attack did not make him abandon the larger campaign. Why not? Because Grant's thinking had moved beyond individual battles. He was looking at the war as a whole. The Union began the campaign with enormous advantages in population, industry, railroads, and supply. The North had around 22 million people. The Confederacy had about 9 million, and nearly half of those were enslaved people who were not available as ordinary soldiers. The North had factories producing weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and boots on a scale the South could not match. It had a railroad network that could move men and supplies quickly. The South had courage and skill, but not the same capacity to replace losses. Grant understood this clearly. If he kept Lee fighting every day, every week, every month, Lee's army would slowly wear down. Not necessarily in one dramatic collapse, but through a steady erosion of men, horses, supplies, morale, and time. If Grant paused to rest, Lee would also rest. If Grant withdrew, Lee would recover. Stopping, in Grant's mind, was worse than continuing.
So after Cold Harbor, despite all the criticism, he moved again. His next great move was toward Petersburg, the vital rail and supply hub south of Richmond. This was not just brute force, it was strategy. Grant understood that if he could threaten Petersburg, Lee would be forced out of his comfort zone and into a larger crisis. In one remarkable maneuver, Grant disengaged from Lee, crossed the James River on a huge pontoon bridge, and shifted his army toward Petersburg without Lee fully grasping what was happening until it was too late. The first Union attacks there did not capture the city quickly, and so the war settled into a long siege. But this was not failure, it was pressure transformed into strangulation. Week by week, Petersburg drained Confederate strength, supplies dwindled, desertions rose, Lee's army thinned. The trap was closing. Then came the political results. In September 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta. That victory, alongside Grant's pressure in Virginia, changed Northern morale. Lincoln, who had seemed vulnerable earlier in the year, won re-election in November. The North committed itself to finishing the war. The Confederacy lost not only men in the field, but also its shrinking hope that Northern politics might save it.
By spring 1865, Lee's position had become impossible. Grant broke through at Petersburg. Lee evacuated Richmond and retreated west, trying to escape and continue the struggle. Grant did what earlier Union generals had failed to do. He kept pursuing. He gave Lee no time to recover, no chance to rebuild, no room to breathe. Sheridan's cavalry cut off roads and blocked escape routes. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered. That is why Grant did not stop. He did not keep moving because he was careless with life. He did not continue because he was incapable of doubt. In fact, the record suggests he felt the weight of the losses deeply. What separated him from others was his willingness to carry that burden and act anyway. He could hold two truths at once, that the suffering was terrible and that ending the war required enduring it. That is what many of his critics missed. They were looking at the horror of the battle in front of them. Grant was looking at the shape of the entire war. He understood that the Confederacy could still survive if Lee was given time, space, and hope. He also understood that constant pressure could destroy all three. So, the answer is not that Grant was heartless. It is almost the opposite. He understood the cost more clearly than most, and he kept going because he believed the cost of stopping would be even greater. That is why the men who sewed their names into their coats at Cold Harbor were still alive to remove them later, because Grant, for all the blood and doubt and criticism, refused to turn back.